Hello, good evening. My name's Rory Hyde. I'm the curator of contemporary architecture and urbanism here at the V&A. And thanks for coming down to the Architecture of Public Truth, one of the events as part of our exhibition All of This Belongs to You, which is looking at the design of public life. We've got a installation just through these doors, and it's otherwise spread all over the museum, so I hope you have a chance tonight or another time to come and see what we've got together. A small, update on the program for tonight. E.L. Weisman's unfortunately unable to join us, but we've got Jacob Burns here in his stead, another researcher from the Forensic Architecture program and currently with Amnesty International. So I don't think we've lost anything. We're hugely pleased to have Jacob here. Thanks for stepping in at the last minute. I'll just try and frame the conversation, I guess, with some thoughts about what is an architect. So the answer ought to be obvious. They design buildings. If you abstract their skills, zooming out beyond the application of intelligence as it applies to their task, what are you left with? They're researchers, they're analysts, they're visualizers. They're able to assemble various forms of information into graphic representation and assist in making decisions, which are ultimately acted upon. Most usually this is the construction of a building. But what if we could apply these skills elsewhere, to places where they're most needed? Instead of designing buildings, could this spatial dexterity be applied to questions of human rights in regions of conflict and disaster? It's presumably this question which led to the creation of the Forensic Architecture Research Group at Goldsmiths, a forensic agency comprised of architects, artists, filmmakers and theorists, examining cases of state and corporate violence and producing evidence as defence. Bolstered by a grant from the European Research Council, the group has in a few short years amassed an astonishing volume of work captured in this book, which is over here on the table. Thank you, Jacob. The word forensis is Latin for pertaining to the forum, meaning an object or debate to be had in public. So I think it's incredibly relevant to have forensic architecture here tonight as part of the All This Belongs to You program, to understand how their work intersects with this idea of the design of public life today. So please make Jacob Burns welcome.
Thank you very much, Rory, and thank you for inviting me and for being here. It's a pleasure. Sorry, I'm just trying to sit down. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the project in general at first, and then discuss the drone strikes project, which is one of the ones that I worked on with forensic architecture when I first joined. I was a research assistant at forensic architecture for about 2 years. I worked on this drone strikes project and also some other projects to do with Israel-Palestine. I'd start with a very basic question, which is kind of the question that I always get asked at family parties when I kind of tell distant relatives or friends of parents, I work in something called forensic architecture, and it's generally met with a high level of confusion about what forensic architecture is, and then why architecture? Why architecture as a tool for investigating these sorts of situations, where there are violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. And the kind of simple answer of why architecture, or what we aim to do by using architecture to investigate in these sorts of situations, is that what we aim to do is turn architecture from kind of something that's always seen as a representation of conflict. The images that we're all very familiar with from wars, throughout the world of kind of buildings in ruins. We want to turn it from simply a representation of conflict, a kind of easy visual trope, into a source of knowledge about conflict and those violations, a source of information about war. Because architecture is often perceived as kind of a dumb background, dumb in the sense that it can't speak, the dumb background to daily life, which hangs there in the background and affects us in certain ways, but ways that we're not quite sure how. But what forensic architecture does, or what we try to do, is really use the potential of architecture as a great big sensor, a material that registers the forces that make up politics and life, especially in conflict zones. So to use the material object of architecture itself, and that can be from a building, a wall, a room, to a whole territory, up to the kind of planetary scale, as use the forces use the registration of the forces on the material to understand those forces themselves. And so we're using the object of architecture to somehow speak. All of the things we do are attempting to make architecture speak as a source of knowledge. And it's in that speaking that the forensics lie. As Rory mentioned, forensis is the kind of Latin origin for the word of forensics. And forensis is the means pertaining to the forum, as Rory said. And the forum in Roman times was a space of many different functions, not merely a kind of space of legal or criminal justice, as kind of forensics is now understood more or less exclusively in relation to. And so what forensic architecture kind of captures is the idea of not only doing research, but presenting information or evidence to an audience, indeed creating an audience around an object, and having that object speak in certain ways. But what this also means is that we acknowledge that the forum has a whole set of characteristics itself, a set of limitations, inherent qualities that affect what can be said and how. I mean, this is obvious when you come to court and you try to take some of the work to court and have to negotiate a series of admissibility requirements, for example. So these kind of limits and protocols affect what and how is presented, or what is and how it is presented into the world. And the forensic architecture and its reference back to the forum also kind of recalls that forensics carries within it a kind of latent politics, an idea that forensics can be a way to have a very political discussion, a kind of creation of a political community, even perhaps around objects. So to kind of take it away from a kind of very abstract idea, I want to talk about this drone strikes project, which was something that we were asked to do by a UN special rapporteur, a man called Ben Emerson, who's a British lawyer, and he's a special rapporteur for counterterrorism and human rights. And in his mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur, he wanted to undertake an inquiry into drone strikes, airstrikes carried out by unmanned aerial vehicles throughout the world. At that time, they'd only been carried out by the United States and Israel. So we looked at a number of cases in Pakistan, Yemen, Afghanistan, Gaza, and there was one other who I'm completely blanking on. So I was involved as a research assistant, and just talk about some of the interesting kind of background to one of the cases that we did, which was an architectural reconstruction of a drone strike that took place in a town called Miran Shah in the tribal areas of Pakistan, which are areas of Pakistan that lie along the border with Afghanistan. And drone strikes are often thought of as this very new thing. They're often referred to in conjunction with new technology, often with scary implications, what kind of became evident as we undertook research into these drone strikes taking place in this area of Pakistan, that there was a whole set of legal, political and historical conditions that were enabling drone strikes to take place in this very specific region of Pakistan. In fact, of roughly 400 drone strikes that there have been since 2004 in Pakistan, all but one have taken place in this area called the federally administrated tribal areas. And it's an area that's kind of held apart from the rest of Pakistan, which is a legacy of British colonialism. Normally when Britain came into the Indian subcontinent and conquered an area, they would be very quick to institute kind of the British governmental and judicial institutions that kind of would be recognizable to us here. But in this area of what is now Pakistan, it was difficult for the British to control the area because it was mountainous, and it was on the border with Afghanistan, which they never succeeded to conquer. So what happened was that it decided that the area would be held under a different legal regime than the rest of British India, and they instituted something called the Frontier Crimes Regulations, which are actually still in effect today, a set of draconian laws from 1901 that basically allow the government to do more or less whatever they like. There's kind of arbitrary detention, collective punishment. It's all mandated in this set of regulations. So this area was kind of, which is perceived often and represented in the media as a place of kind of inherent violence and wildness and savagery and lawlessness, is somewhere that was created as that kind of unit in many ways. And so what happens is that this legal history, which as kind of forensic people were interested in, informs the very possibility of drone strikes in the region. It's because it's a kind of region apart in Pakistan that these drone strikes can take place there. And we can think of drone strikes as a kind of control of visibility, a kind of control over who sees and who gets to see what, and who is able to represent and who is able to make visible. Because it's very difficult to move, but access to the region is limited by the Pakistani government. Image making is also limited by both the government and militias that operate there. So there's a whole set of kind of considerations of imagery that kind of considerations of limits on visibility that underlie this area. So it was with great interest that we saw that this a video had been smuggled out from this town called Miran Shah, and it's a rare video of the aftermath of a drone strike, and it was kind of presented as a kind of piece of visual evidence that America was in fact bombing in Waziristan, something that was kind of denied for many years completely by the Americans, and it's quite recognizable in that, it looks more or less like the imagery that we're all used to from war zones. But what forensic architecture wanted to do was to analyze the video in a complete manner, to draw every last thing that we could from the imagery. And this starts with a consideration of the frame itself, of the conditions of the shooting of the video. As you can see, what happens is that a frame of a window keeps intruding into the video, and we see that the person is holding the camera is often shooting from well within the room, staying out of sight. So it tells us something about the kind of danger, the kind of the great risk inherent in this video testimony that this person took, and it's in that way it kind of shows the value of the video. So I mean, because we're a bit short on time, I don't want to go for too long, kind of rambling. So I'll just kind of leave it playing over the top while I speak over the top, because what we're often told, or what we were often told by the US government about the drone strike campaign, was that, you know, it's impossible to know anything about what goes on in this region of the world, and you know, but you should trust us that no civilians are dying in this campaign. It was maintained up until sort of 2012, I think, something like that, you know, absolutely zero civilian casualties had occurred during the campaign, when that was, you know, contradicted by all the reporting from the region. So what the video is trying to do is stake a claim for knowledge, for a kind of possibility of investigation, an incredibly thorough investigation that, you know, takes this bit of shaky video and through a set of architectural techniques locates exactly within this city where the video was taking place, manages to verify that through, you know, using the shadows cast by the buildings as a confirming of the kind of volume of the buildings in the image and the time at which it was taken. And it was kind of taken as, well, what we intended was to say with this video, look, it's possible to mount this sort of investigation with the meager access to imagery that we have as kind of, in many senses, members of the public. You, with all your access to hours and hours of drone footage in what they claim is very high resolution, should be able to mount a much more credible investigation of what's happening and who is dying in these strikes. So this is what I was saying by kind of wanting almost to use the video to create a forum, to have a political discussion around this kind of the material object of the video, to demand that, you know, we enter this into evidence, and that we should, you know, it should be a conversation that should be taken up by more people in the government than just an anonymous security source. And of course, you should also say that, you know, the material in the video itself is all shaped by kind of the input of the UN Special Rapporteur in terms of what we can and can't say under international humanitarian law. So I think maybe just to conclude, and then we can have a discussion maybe. It's to say that architecture here provides a set of tools, a kind of attention to detail, a kind of claim that the images that we see are not just flat surfaces, but that we need to engage with the kind of depth and content of images that we're kind of overwhelmed with in the world, and that we can pull multiple things from these videos as evidence. And this is kind of the idea of why architecture is so valuable in this situation, and then to use the kind of innovative presentation, the techniques that aren't often used in traditional human rights work to kind of build a community, an audience around the work that might not otherwise exist. You know, many people do not read the standard long 40, 50-page human rights report, but, you know, people perhaps are more likely to engage with this, and what sort of, and kind of experiment in what kind of transformative potential that could bring. So I don't know, maybe I should leave it there and then we can discuss, and I mean, maybe there's questions about the video or what I've said in general. So
Thanks very much, Jacob. That was a terrific presentation and a great introduction, I think, to the work of the group and to, well, your work and how, and the role that it plays within it. You talked about, well, I mean, the first question that comes to mind is the question of truth, or the question of trust, perhaps. Can we when I read the book, it's incredibly captivating, incredibly persuasive, but I was left with this nagging question: do we trust architecture students to be making documents for, international criminal courts? And it's sort of, well, maybe I'll leave it at that. How can we trust your group and the techniques it uses, and what are the means in which it's validated?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm trying to think of a good answer. I think what's interesting about the work is that it somehow pulls apart this idea of truth and objectivity. You expect science and scientific techniques to be objective, this kind of false position of complete detachment, whereas I think what we're trying to do is use these kind of scientific architectural techniques to make claims, but at the same time, critique our own selves in saying, but of course we are constructing truth. All truth is a kind of construct, which is difficult, as you say, when you're going to court, because you're somehow presenting evidence while undermining the kind of philosophical basis on which you could know or present evidence. So there's a kind of a conflict there in that sense. But in terms of trust, it's you have to navigate the kind of position of or kind of avoid the pitfall of just presenting yourself as an expert, as someone qualified by someone else to speak about something, to recognize that there are many forms of knowledge and evidence, and to listen to a diverse array of those without necessarily needing to kind of give a rubber stamp to them all. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but...
So the trust or the truth needs to be communicated through the documents. You're saying you can't rely on this expert witness that somehow has more knowledge or right to that knowledge than anybody else, and therefore, why not architecture students? Why not the public? Why not anybody with a mobile phone camera testifying in these types of questions?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what we're keen on is to emphasize that there's all sorts of forms of knowledge in the world. For example, some of the cases that we deal with are dispossession of Bedouin who live in the south of Israel, in the Negev desert, and basically their claims to their land are oral claims. It's kind of oral system of it was passed on from so and so to so and so to so and so, which is of course when an Israeli court comes along, they want to see documents. They can't. There's a kind of exploitation there of a different form of law and knowledge to effect a dispossession. So what we're trying to say, I mean, in that and many other cases, that there's lots of ways to construct knowledge and evidence, and we should be respecting those in their kind of multiplicity.
One of the other forms of knowledge which you bring to these questions is architectural knowledge. I mean, I guess to compare it simply with journalism, for instance, where it might be the tools might be the notebook, the interview, the witness, the feet on the ground, or the research. What does bringing a spatial or temporal or graphic approach to research add to understanding of these types of questions, or add to the persuasiveness of the claims you're putting forward?
I think there's a number of things. I mean, one of which is that as we are today, there's a kind of pictures or it didn't happen mentality. It's now quite a lot when we're working in the occupied West Bank. What happens is that the cases that gain attention and that gain kind of legal recourse are ones that have been filmed. And in fact, judges are now saying, when you present a case with only a testimony, you know, well, it's just a testimony, it's fallible, how do we know that they're not lying? You know, there's no pictures to prove it. And that's seen kind of right across the world. There's been a shift away from a kind of system of gaining knowledge about things that happen far away from people's testaments, from people speaking about it, to gaining knowledge primarily pictorially. So we need to, as people engaged with kind of human rights, etc., we really need to engage with the pictorial strategy. And I think there's a whole range of benefits from doing so. But it's also a balance of how do you work in these strategies while also legitimizing the testimony of the survivor or the victim. So I don't know if I quite answered your question.
No, absolutely. I mean, you also mentioned the ambition to make these documents compelling, to make them more interesting than an infographic or something two-dimensional, but to potentially use them as tools to, I guess, empower or communicate to a broader public. Is it as much about putting these questions on the agenda as it is appealing to that judge or jury or courtroom?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the central questions that informs the kind of format in which you're working, the kind of aesthetic questions of making a video, or are you making an interactive report or a web platform? We have to be aware that there's many more kind of forums in which we're trying to present this evidence than merely legal. We're not merely interested in kind of pursuing legal work, but also kind of public or political work. The members of the group, or many of them are activists with political organizations who, really trying to prompt these discussions in a kind of different way.
Yeah, I love this phrase you used, which is to use the video to create a forum, that somehow the video itself can become a site or a place with which to have that discussion.
Yeah, and also, in a project that we're working on at the moment, I'm working at Amnesty International on the Israel-Palestine team, and we're actually collaborating with Forensic Architecture on a kind of an interactive web platform about the war in Gaza last summer. So it's powered by a big database of all the events that took place, all of the something like 2,000 airstrikes, drone strikes, shootings, recorded in this database and presented in a kind of way that allows the user to actually go in and conduct their own research on what happened, to pick out trends, to read about different events and make links between them, to somehow really pull someone in a way that is quite user-friendly, but actually leads to being quite a powerful tool for that person to then go on and do their own research. And I hope that there'll be more projects like that it's not just a static video, that someone can't really do anything but watch.
I mean, perhaps to look at the group itself and the types of skills that are brought together there. So perhaps if you could describe, what kinds of backgrounds or what kinds of expertise sit within forensic architecture, and how a case might come into the group, and how it's handled.
Well, I mean, we're led by Eyal Weitzman, who's an architect and an academic, and we tend to kind of form different small teams around the projects. Someone will approach us, like an NGO, for example, Defense for Children International Palestine, who we worked with producing a video analysis of the shooting of 2 Palestinian teens last year. excuse me, and we'll kind of analyze what the material is in the case. You know, are we dealing with a video, a series of images, satellite analysis? Are we dealing with text that we'll somehow have to bring to life? And then there's different sorts of characters involved. The project coordinator is someone called Francesco Sevragondi, who is an architect. And then there used to be me, who was completely visually illiterate, and doing the kind of research, the more traditional, shall we say, research. And when we have other architects, web designers working with us kind of on a specific basis to kind of somehow pull all these things together. It makes it sound like prosaic and mundane, which I suppose it is, really.
I mean, to perhaps focus on or discuss the video which you presented. So the translation of this shaky footage, which on first glance just looks like, you know, any other war zone, any other, you know, space where a bomb's gone off, just rubble, just sort of proof that it happened, but not any information to be extracted from it. So perhaps talk us through the steps of processing and how it was used ultimately.
So, yeah, I mean, this was particularly complicated as well by, because we had, something that's not in the video is that we'd received some information from a journalist at New York Times about where they thought it happened in the city. And actually part of the process, it took quite a long time, was actually disproving that original location was not where it happened. That was in fact damage caused by the Pakistani army, who also fight in the region a lot. So we'd be taking an image of the first location, which was destroyed, and we'd identify kind of things in the background that we could see, like the green coping on the edge of the roof of the building in the background. And then we looked at a video of a protest that had taken place in the town, and spotted that same green coping on the roof, and started to align the other elements, you know, sort of distinctive shape of, I can't remember, distinctive shape of some building element, and to find both in the video and in the picture, so that you're starting then to compare the two and can orient where the person is standing, and then to start looking at satellite images, to then coming up with lots of different theories about where this place might be, and eventually then analyzing the original video, the shaky video that was taken, and looking at the heights of buildings. Heights of buildings are really useful because they cast a shadow, and longer shadows, you can start to measure the heights of buildings through analyzing the length of their shadow. And so you can confirm that the kind of the building on the left that you see, which is taller, and there's one in front of you, you can find them in the satellite. So it's a process of kind of painstaking corroboration, and coming up with lots of different theories, looking at street morphology, kind of engaging with the urban form as a kind of rich resource from which to draw all this information.
We'll open up to questions in a moment, if anybody has one. But just to conclude on that point, this idea of the building as a sensor, I think, is an incredibly productive way to think about architecture, where we, you know, the study of history, or perhaps the way architecture is communicated in museums like this one, is as an authored product, something which is a creative product, something which is almost at its most authentic or true at the moment of completion, not as a tool into which read history or other unofficial narratives not endorsed by the architect. So it seems to be a productive inversion how we understand the built environment and what we can extract from it.
Yeah, and what I always find interesting when Eyal talks about kind of some of what inspired him to kind of come up with this way of working is that he wasn't in fact kind of interested in architects and what architects do, but in building surveyors. Because building surveyors understand that a building is not a static object. It hasn't just been frozen in time at completion. They understand the change of the building and the registering of all sorts of forces, from the weather and the climate, changes in the climate, to changes in the subsoil, etc., etc. And so see someone who sees architecture in a very detailed and living way, in fact, and kind of taking inspiration from that kind of humble, often thought of the humble figure of the building surveyor to really draw out the full potential and kind of excitement of architecture. I mean, it's such an amazing thing.
I find it extremely interesting, but like the building in the Bombay is such a physical thing. Why you just don't fly there? And instead of making theory, you speak with local people, you take pictures from different angles. So it seems you have like an extremely digital approach to something that is really physical. Is there any reason? It's just budgeting or timing or?
No. I mean, generally this approach is used in sites that we can access. So, for example, it's incredibly dangerous to travel to Miran Shah. I mean, very, very few. Westerners are only able to go with the Pakistani army, and that's only. They're not free to move around, and it's very difficult to go there. It's a conflict zone. Also, for example, to go to Gaza, where we also do a lot of work, it's not possible because we don't have access because of the blockade. So it's a kind of way of engaging with spaces that are remote from us. The ideal is to go to the site and simply to look and see what happens. But in many cases, we're not able to access a site. So that's why we have to go through the kind of whole painstaking process. I agree, it would be much better to just go.
And that, the limitations put on your work are both spatial, but also somehow graphic or infrastructural. So as I understand it, the resolution of the publicly available aerial satellite imagery is intentionally fuzzed or made low resolution, somehow the scale of a metre, rather than what the military have access to or what government have access to. So you're also put at a disadvantage, even from behind your computer, compared to the organisations or institutions which you're trying to counter.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a very important point, which is that forensics is often a state practice. It's the way that the state looks at us and decides whether we're criminals or what have you. But what we're making a claim for is forensics as a practice by which we can look at states and other powerful people such as corporations. So yes, we're always at a disadvantage when we're investigating a drone strike in Miran Shah as opposed to the US who carried out the drone strike. But it's precisely the kind of difficulties that we're somehow making a claim, it's in the difficulty, in the kind of looking at less resolution that the kind of political claim lies again. And that, as you say, affects the methodology and the output and the aesthetics, everything.
Well, while you think of your questions, I have another one, which I guess it picks up on this question of inversion, on the role of forensic architecture as trying to advocate for the broader public or those citizens rather than the state or rather than the top hierarchy. How do you draw the line between being objective and being persuasive? Or do you even need to appeal to being objective? Or is the point to be persuasive?
Yeah, no, the point is to abandon objectivity, to stop pretending there is something called objectivity. You know, everything what we do is motivated by a political agenda, as everything everybody does is motivated by a political agenda. And somehow it's an approach that tells people to stop, or asks people to stop being disingenuous, but to put the kind of tools of science, as I said, which is supposed to be objectivity, at the kind of service of political struggles for people who are disenfranchised or what have you.
There's a very nice quote from Thomas Keenan in the book where he says that evidence is what is used to persuade. It does not mean what is true. And I found that a really almost shockingly surprising statement from a legal perspective, that somehow there's a difference between evidence and truth. This is a big question, but perhaps you can respond to this gap.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think also what should be also always taken from the work is this kind of foregrounding of the fact that, you know, we are intervening in this situation in order to make these architectural objects speak. You know, there is absolutely a kind of there's a need to narrativize what we see. We can't, you know, we can't make a claim with the kind of the shaky video without intervening into the kind of the guts of it in some way and mobilizing that. And I suppose where that's different from how, you know, for example, states would try to do that with, you know, there was the example this week of Russia having faked satellite imagery in the kind of the downing of the Malaysian airliner. Is that we try to be upfront about what it is that we're doing and why we're saying what we're saying. That, you know, everybody intervenes in imagery and image making and politics and all of this, but that, you know, our intervention is motivated by this and we have done this.
Any questions? Well, I guess another question for you, Jacob, is you find yourself now in Amnesty International, which seems to be a sort of interesting trajectory out of the forensic architecture program into you know, amazing NGO with global reach. Are you able to apply these ways of thinking and these tools in your work there, and what are you working on at the moment? What's next?
Well, I mean, I think what I'm really interested in is kind of seeing human rights work as in the light of questions about design, and how we get people to engage with what organizations like Amnesty say, basically, because the traditional way of working for an organization like that is to take the testimonies of witnesses or survivors and to write a report with them. And I don't really think anybody apart from a very small subset of kind of concerned people actually read these reports. So, I mean, we see now the huge popularity of things like infographics, with the drone strikes. There was the I've forgotten who did it now, but the kind of the interactive thing that zipped across, not the interactive, sorry, but the kind of the graphic that, I don't even know how to describe it in words, and I can't remember what it's called, so I can't even show it on the computer. You know, anything. Anyway, a graphic representation of the situation that was immensely popular, that people actually started to engage with. And it's about, you know, for me, how do you bring the depth and the kind of research and kind of deep engagement with the situation that you get from a report, and how do you make that accessible to a much wider section of the public? How so that's, you know, those are kind of the projects that I want to be working on, and we're working on stuff to do with the Gaza anniversary, as I said, with forensic architecture, the anniversary of last year's war. So a kind of interactive report
attack on a town called Rafah, and yeah, the platform.
I mean, perhaps there's one last question before we wrap up, which connects to this earlier question about distance, or about being separated from the site by these digital interfaces. I mean, in a way, to draw a sort of crude parallel, it's a similar remove to the drone pilot who might be sitting in an air-conditioned warehouse in Houston, working for the US military, flying over Pakistan. In a similar sense, you're sitting behind a computer in London, also removed spatially, physically, perhaps emotionally from that space. But the work that you're doing is incredibly harrowing. I mean, at the end of this video, we see the analysis of effectively shrapnel on the, well, not effectively, we see the analysis of shrapnel in an interior, and the suggestion that this is where people were sitting. This is people who are dead, and their shadows are in a way imprinted on the room. I mean, it's incredibly harrowing, confronting stuff that's delivered in a very, well, slick, deadpan way. Do you, even from at this remove, in sitting here in comfortable London, feel emotionally attached? Does this work affect you in the same way?
Yes, it is the short answer. You know, there is an emotional connection, especially, you know, in some cases, you know, where you'll be speaking to people who lost family members, what have you, and there is an emotional connection there, but it is different from being there. And I think this kind of question of remoteness is one that's, yeah, really pressing actually for people who work in kind of human rights and journalism in general, because there's a real trend to kind of be remote from the places on which you're reporting, often necessary. But there's also sometimes a kind of way in which we're outsourcing kind of information gathering and transferring risk to people in dangerous places. It's kind of a mirroring of the economic outsourcing and the kind of military risk transfer war that's kind of practiced by the people that we like to think we're arrayed against. And so I think figuring out the kind of connection between our work remotely and how we engage with sites in a kind of proper and meaningful way is really challenging across the sector. And yeah, we do, you know, there is also, you know, we're mobilizing military technology. Anytime you use satellite imagery, you're mobilizing the military technology. So there is uncomfortable resonances between the work and the kind of thing you're investigating, and it's an ongoing process to think that through.
Well, unless we have any further questions. Oh, here we go. Now they're all coming thick and fast. We've got two.
How do you double check if the footage you get isn't fake or just a perspective somebody wants you to see? Because especially in an area where you can't get access to it, it could just we're probably seeing just a little part of the damage in that area. So.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, exactly. You know, the videos are always a perspective of what somebody wants you to see, and so it's a really important question. I mean, there's various things that you can do to verify that a video has not been faked, and we go through that. And I think that's what I was saying also about, you know, in terms of the perspective and it being only a thing that somebody wants you to see is somehow being honest about the material, kind of acknowledging its limitations and its kind of the way in which it's embroiled in a whole spectrum of political things, but kind of trying to be upfront about those relations and still admit that even though it's embroiled in politics, what isn't, that there's a use there, and there's a utility. opacity.
Yeah, I was just wondering, obviously the campaign is trying to, or the project is trying to get people to take this information and make connections for themselves and make up their own minds on what is being presented to them. I was wondering how your organisation or even Amnesty or those organisations measure success in a campaign like this. Like, what kind of barometer do you have for that? Is there like an end game, or do you have a specific remit? Or
No, it's an excellent question, and it's one kind of which I think everybody is still searching for the answer for. I don't have a good answer. I mean, in certain cases, it becomes easier to answer that question when you're involved in specific legal cases. For example, some of the things that we have contributed evidence to, like a case in the West Bank in Palestine, where we submitted evidence in a case where the Israelis wanted to build the separation wall through a World Heritage site around the village that would cut also the village off from its land. You know, that case, we won the case. The wall's not going to be built there, so that's a success. We can say that. But yeah, I mean, in the drone strike inquiry, it was presented at the UN. The UN listened to it. I don't think they really, I think they probably expressed concern or something. Drone strikes are still going on in Pakistan. So sometimes you have to, it's very difficult to know if you've made a difference. Well, obviously I haven't really made a difference, but it's a difficult question, and I don't also personally have a clear answer as to what I want. I don't think I would just say I want peace for all of the world or something easy like that. I don't know. It's very difficult, but it's a very good question.
And at the back here.
I think to follow up on that, do you carefully archive all of the material you've got? Because, I mean, one way that success might happen is that evidence now that may not seem to garner support might be able to be used in the future. So that if you actually have an archive, you might build up an archive of particular drone strikes, and then there may be, so that you are oriented towards the future and not just the present.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what's really interesting, this was a conversation I had when I interviewed a Palestinian lawyer who works in southern Israel, bringing cases in Israeli courts for families in Gaza who've lost family members in Israeli attacks. He loses every single case. He never wins a case because, among other things, there's a law on the books. Even when you bring a civil case in Israel, there's a tort law that says Israel will not cover any damages arising from an act of war. So he loses every single case. And I said, well, how do you get up in the morning and find the will to go to court? And he says, well, by bringing the cases, you create an archive, and you create a record for international judicial organizations such as the ICC to say, that we've attempted to obtain redress in domestic courts and it's not possible. And so we do archive stuff, and I think it's also important to say that forensics is, as a kind of as a practice, is always a looking again. It's the second look at something that tells you about what's gone on. It's always a kind of the detective coming in and looking at something and spotting something that the first person to look at the scene might not have seen. So the archive then plays a really important role in that.
Well, Jacob Burns, thanks so much for coming to V&A, presenting this incredible work, and we wish you all the luck going forward.
Thank you very much for listening.